Welcome back. In this third in our series of instructions on Excel basics, we're going to talk about the formula bar a little bit, and this is going to be a multi-part sub-series within our introductory series talking about formulas and how you format them, because obviously this is where the rubber really meets the road when you're using Excel. So let's take a look at the worksheet. Now, one of the first things that I wanted to talk about was my preference for how I edit formulas, and this is a personal preference, but right now the way this Excel workbook is set up, it's set up with the default way of editing cells that Excel, when it comes out of the box, will operate this way. So for example, if I come into this cell here at D1 and I want to put in this formula, I'm just going to multiply 45 times whatever is over here at F. Right now there's nothing at F, but that comes to 2 at F1. If I had a 1 there, it would come up with a number. But anyways, so there's two things here that are going on that I'm not a big fan of. The first one is that it's set up so that you edit directly here in the cell. So I'm not a big fan of that. Then the other thing is that when you hit enter, I don't know if you noticed, but whenever I hit enter, then the cursor automatically drops down one row in the current column. So both of those things are things that I prefer Excel not to do. So the way that I have my formula editing set up, you go to Options. So Options is down here under More, Options, Advanced. And the first thing I do is under Editing Options, I click off this cursor moving down. And then the other thing that I check off is this Allow Editing Directly in Cells, because I don't really want it to edit directly in cells. And there's other reasons why I prefer not to do that I'll get into later. But so here we are again looking with that change and how it impacts the way that Excel works. So let's put in a similar formula times some number at G, and I'll just put in a 1 at G. So you notice that when I put in that formula, for one thing, it didn't kick down the cursor one cell, which I don't like. But now if I come up here and I click to edit this formula, you'll notice I can't edit directly into this cell anymore. Okay, so that is really a preference, but the reason for that preference is one that's kind of important, and I'll just briefly try and explain, is that it's more for debugging. So let's say I have a situation like this where I have more than just one worksheet. So here I just added this sheet 4. So I'm back over here at the basic sheet, and I'm going to say 51 plus some number over here on sheet 4. Right? So right now, if I hit enter, there's a 0 over here. Right, so now it shows 46, but where this is important is let's say I want to debug this. So now the way that Excel was set up before, if I double click on this, it would say, oh, you must want to edit this cell. But now what it's going to do is when I double click on this, it's going to take me to this other sheet 4 and kind of what is being referenced in this cell, which is a bit of a debugging tool. So that's important to utilize, for me at least. So you have to decide what your preference is, but this is the behavior that you're going to see moving forward as I show you these examples. So now with that, here are kind of the key ways to enter formulas. So if you're on this cell, E1, and I want to begin entering a formula, I have two ways of doing it. I can either press F2, and you'll note that up here, this X and this check mark get highlighted when the formula bar up here becomes active. So if I hit F2, there, now you can see that I'm in the formula bar, and it's allowing me now to enter some formula if I want to there. So that's one way to do it. Another way is if I'm here, if I just hit the equal sign will pop up there, and again it knows that I want to begin entering a formula. So that is a second way to enter a formula. Now, we've talked a little bit about, or you notice how cells are addressed. So if I want to reference other cells in an equation, I can either use the mouse key here. I'm using the up mouse arrow to get to the cell, or I can just use my mouse over here and I can click on the cell to add it to the equation. So that's another way to modify or create an equation. Now, one thing to understand about equations is that the way these equations are, they are considered relative references. So what I mean by that is if I were to copy this formula here down one cell, it's going to change the addresses here to the second row. So here, if I click here, one thing you'll notice, if you're in a cell and you click into this box, it highlights these cells that are referenced in the formula, and it also color codes the cells that it's referencing. See how that's red, that's blue, that's blue. But when I copied this, and there's two ways to copy it. In this instance, I just grabbed this little handle here and I just pulled it down and it copied the formula automatically for me. But you see how it changed the rows, and now it's looking at these two rows. But since there's no numbers there, it's 0. But I could put a 5 here and a 25 here. Another way to copy a formula is to hit Control C and then go down one and hit Control V, and it had the same behavior as using the drag bar, except now it's looking down here. So what's the difference here? So these are considered relative references, meaning that as I change this formula or I copy this formula, it creates a new relative reference to the cell. So here I just copy this over a row, and you can see now it's moved the columns that it's looking at. So it's making a relative adjustment based on where the cell is, where the formula is. Okay? So the other option is to have an absolute reference. And the way that you make a cell an absolute reference is let's say I'm going to get rid of some of this. So let's say I'm doing what I was doing earlier. I'm saying this number plus this number. And here I'm going to use something very quickly here. I'm going to use a Control X. So Control X cuts the current formula and just moves it there for me. So I still basically have the same formula, just now I've moved it. If I move this down, I'm still dealing with the relative references. But let's say I have over here, I have this number here, and I always want this cell, I always want this formula that's in this column to reference this constant here. So what I can do is I'm going to modify, I'm going to edit this cell. I'm going to put it in here. Okay, so now you see it's 128, but if I were to do the same thing I've been doing and move it down here, right, it's making that relative reference change again. But if I want to make this fixed, I can come up here, and if I put in a $sign here on the column and a $sign on the row, now that becomes an absolute reference. So now if I do the same thing and I copy this cell down, you'll see I get a totally different result. So now it's still referencing this H1. It's doing a relative reference on these two values, but it's not doing it on this H1. So another way to do this without having to type in the dollar signs is to hit F4, the F4 key. So if I hit the F4 key, so I can have an absolute cell reference, which puts the dollar sign in front of both the H and the 1. So if I hit H4 once, I get H1 as being the absolute reference. If I hit F4 again, it changes it to an absolute row reference and a relative column reference. If I hit H4 again, it turns it into an absolute column reference and a relative row reference. And then if I hit it one more time, then it converts it back to all relative. So that's a little bit about absolute and relative cells, and you'll see more of that later.